There was a time when London was the center of everything. Not just Britain, everything. The money, the culture, the power, the ambition. If you were rich, you came to London. If you were talented, you came to London. If you wanted to matter, London was where you went to prove it. For 3 centuries, this city was the operating system of the world. That time is ending. And the people who built modern London are the first ones to know it. This is not a story about Brexit, though Brexit plays a role. It is not a story about taxes, though taxes are part of it. It is the story of how the most storied financial capital in the Western world entered a phase of quiet, structural decline that the marketing campaigns, the property brochures, and the government press releases have spent years trying to hide. The wealth is leaving. The talent is following. And what is being left behind is a city that looks like London, sounds like London, but no longer functions like the London that once commanded empires. If you have been watching this city carefully, you already know something is wrong. What we are about to show you is why and what it means for the decade ahead. If you want to watch empires fall in real time, before the rest of the world catches on, subscribe. Empire Falls documents the decline that mainstream media is too invested in denying to cover honestly. Let us start, not with the obvious, not with the empty offices or the statistics about population outflows. Let us start with something smaller, because that is always where the real story lives. A detail so specific that it cuts through all the noise. On New Bond Street, one of the most expensive retail corridors on the planet, there are empty units. Not renovation hoardings hiding a coming relaunch, empty units. Dark windows in buildings where, 5 years ago, you could not secure a lease for any price. The landlords are not releasing the numbers. The agents are saying the right things about transitional cycles and post-pandemic recalibration. But the windows are dark, and in a street that once had waiting lists measured in years, dark windows are not a cycle. They are a signal. London has sent this signal before. It just always managed to recover before anyone had to acknowledge it had arrived. This time, the pattern is different. To understand why, you have to understand what London actually was, not what the tourism campaigns say it is. What it actually was, functionally, economically, historically. London was not merely a great city. It was an extraction machine of extraordinary sophistication. For 200 years, under the formal empire, and for another 70 years after it, London extracted talent, capital, and cultural authority from every corner of the globe and concentrated it in a single metropolitan basin. The City of London, that ancient square mile with its own laws and its own police force and its own Lord Mayor, was the global clearinghouse for everything that mattered in finance. When Hong Kong money moved, it often moved through London first. When a Russian oligarch wanted to launder a reputation, he bought a Chelsea townhouse. When a tech founder from Mumbai wanted to be taken seriously by European institutional money, she moved her headquarters to Shoreditch. London's genius was not production. It was aggregation. The city did not need to make things. It needed to be the place where the people who made things came to become legitimate. That model is breaking down. And the breakdown is not happening slowly enough to be ignored anymore. Here is the number that changes everything, because the whole story lives inside it. Between 2017 and 2023, the United Kingdom lost more high-net-worth residents than any other country in Western Europe. The Center for Economics and Business Research estimated that in 2023 alone, over 10,000 millionaires left Britain, with the vast majority departing from or through London. That single-year figure represented a 42% increase from the prior year. Not a blip, an acceleration. When wealth leaves a city at that velocity, it does not travel alone. It takes the lawyers who structured the portfolios. It takes the private art advisors, the family offices, the bespoke accountants. It takes the restaurants that depended on that clientele, the members' clubs that required that density of wealthy individuals to remain viable, the schools where those families enrolled their children. The departure of wealth is not an event. It is a cascade. And London's cascade began years before the world started paying attention. Where did they go? The answer to that question is more damaging to London's long-term position than the departures themselves. Because the ultra-wealthy did not disperse randomly, they converged. Dubai absorbed the largest single cohort, a city that has spent 15 years deliberately constructing the infrastructure of wealth aggregation that London once monopolized. Monaco saw renewed interest from those who wanted European time zones without European tax exposure. Milan, Zurich, and Lisbon absorbed others. Singapore took the Asian origin capital that had previously been routed through London. These were not accidental relocations. They were structured decisions made by people with the resources to go anywhere, who looked at what London had become and calculated that the return no longer justified the cost. That calculation matters. Because when the ultra-wealthy leave a city, they are not just moving their bodies, they are rendering a verdict. And London, for the first time in its modern history, is receiving a verdict it cannot appeal. But wealth flight alone does not collapse a city. Cities have lost their financial elites before and survived, sometimes thriving without them. What makes London different? What elevates this from a story about rich people leaving to a story about structural decline is what is happening in the layers below the ultra-wealthy. Because London is not just losing its billionaires, it is losing its middle class. And it is losing its young. The numbers here are extraordinary in their clarity. London's population aged 25 to 34, the cohort that historically drove the city's creative and economic renewal, declined by over 80,000 between 2019 and 2022, according to Office for National Statistics data. These were not oligarchs. These were architects and software engineers and journalists and young professionals who had arrived in London carrying the belief that the city rewarded ambition. Many of them left because they could no longer afford to stay. Average rent in London hit a new record high in 2023, crossing £2,000 per month for the first time for a typical one-bedroom flat. For context, that figure represents 68% of the average after-tax income of a young professional in their late 20s. A city that consumes 68% of a young person's income does not attract and retain talent. It filters for people who already have money and drives away everyone else. And a city that drives away everyone else eventually finds that everyone else was the thing that made it worth having money in. There is a particular kind of institutional blindness that afflicts great cities when they are entering decline. They see the symptoms but refuse to name the disease. London has been living inside that blindness for a decade. The housing crisis was called a temporary problem. The exodus of EU workers after Brexit was called an adjustment. The departure of hedge funds and asset managers to Paris, Dublin, and Amsterdam was called an overreaction. Each individual symptom was catalogued and explained away. What was never done was what any serious analysis requires: stepping back and asking whether these symptoms form a pattern. They do. They form exactly the pattern that precedes the fall of every financial capital in modern history. This is the part that most people watching London refuse to hear, because it touches something that feels almost sacred. London's status as a global financial hub was never primarily about London itself. It was about access. Access to European markets. Access to global capital flows. Access to a legal and regulatory framework that financial institutions trusted. Brexit did not just remove London from the European single market. It removed London from the architecture of trust that took 40 years to construct. The banks that left, the clearinghouses that relocated, the trading desks that moved to Paris and Frankfurt were not making political statements. They were following the structural logic of where business could now legally and efficiently be conducted. And that logic no longer leads to London in the way it once did. Paris, to the visible irritation of anyone who has spent time in City of London boardrooms, has been the primary beneficiary. The French capital added over 200 financial sector firms and 30,000 financial services jobs in the 5 years following the Brexit vote. That is not coincidence. That is redirection. The flow of financial activity that once ran through London is being rerouted, and the rerouting is becoming permanent. Once a firm builds its European clearing infrastructure in Paris, once it hires the compliance teams and establishes the regulatory relationships and signs the 10-year office leases, it does not come back to London because a trade deal gets renegotiated. The infrastructure is already somewhere else. If that pattern sounds familiar, it should. It is the pattern of every port city that watched trade routes shift in the age of steam. The city does not immediately collapse. The buildings are still there. The history is still there. The brand is still there. But the function has moved, and function is the only thing that keeps a city alive in the long run. Here is where the pattern becomes genuinely unsettling for anyone who has followed how great financial cities declined. It is not the collapse that defines them. It is the stasis. The period where the city is still expensive enough to deter new entrants, still prestigious enough to maintain a surface of respectability, but no longer dynamic enough to generate the growth that justifies either the expense or the prestige. This is the phase that economic historians sometimes call the hollow empire phase, and London is entering it now. The evidence is visible in the property market in a way that, once you understand what you are looking at, you cannot unsee. Prime central London property, the Belgravia townhouses, the Mayfair penthouses, the Kensington mansions that once sold within days of listing and attracted buyers from every continent, has been stuck in a multi-year decline, measured not just in prices, but in transaction volumes. Knight Frank's own research showed prime central London prices fell in real terms by over 20% between their 2014 peak and 2023. That is nearly a decade of value destruction in the very segment of the market that is supposed to be the most resilient, because the buyers are the most financially sophisticated. When the most sophisticated buyers in the world decide that an asset has peaked, they are usually right. And they are not just sellers now, they are non-buyers. The demand that would have cleared the market of its unsold inventory is simply not arriving, because the people who would have arrived are arriving somewhere else. A former private banker, now based in Geneva, described it with an economy of language that stays with you. He said that London used to be where people went to arrive. Now, it is where people go to remember having arrived. That line contains an entire civilizational shift. The city as past tense. The city as museum of its own greatness. The museums, incidentally, are still excellent. That is not a small thing. London's cultural infrastructure, the galleries, the theaters, the universities, the publishing houses, the design studios, retains an authority that no other city in Europe can match. This is the part of the London story that makes the decline complicated and interesting rather than simple and catastrophic. London is not Detroit. It is not a city that made one thing and collapsed when that thing became obsolete. It is a city that made many things, and some of those things are proving far more durable than others. But here is what history teaches about this specific configuration. The cities that survive the loss of their economic function by falling back on their cultural prestige do survive in a meaningful sense. They remain important. They remain visited, studied, celebrated. What they do not remain is the kind of place that changes the world. Venice survived the collapse of its commercial empire by becoming the most beautiful museum in existence. Constantinople, after it fell, became Istanbul, a different kind of great city. Lisbon, after the Portuguese Empire contracted, became a beloved and gentle place of fado and azulejos and extraordinary food. It did not, however, remain the axis of global commerce it had once been. This is the trajectory that serious analysts of London are now discussing in private, even when they are careful not to discuss it in public. Not collapse. Transformation. London becoming a version of itself that is softer, more cultural, more livable in some ways, but smaller in the ways that historically defined its greatness. The size question is not metaphorical. London's population, which grew continuously for 50 years, is now in a period of measurable net outflow. The city's own data showed a net negative domestic migration figure for multiple consecutive years before the pandemic, with the trend accelerating afterwards. People born in London are leaving at a rate that exceeds the rate of domestic arrivals. International arrivals still provide some offset, but the composition of that international flow is changing, with lower average income levels than the outflow it is replacing. A city can absorb a lot of demographic change. What it struggles to absorb is an outflow of wealth and skills combined with an inflow of populations that require, rather than generate, fiscal capacity. The implications for London's public services its transport infrastructure, its schools are already visible to anyone who uses them regularly. The Tube, once the envy of every city that tried to build urban rail, now runs aging rolling stock on lines that were designed for a city that has grown far beyond their original capacity, with investment levels that consistently fall short of what engineering surveys identify as necessary for reliability. The NHS in London is in a state that anyone who has needed non-emergency medical attention in the past 5 years understands without requiring statistics to explain it. These are not random failures. They are the predictable outcomes of a fiscal trajectory that has been pointing in one direction for a decade and a half. The empire does not feel it is falling when you are inside it. That is the most important thing the historical record tells us, and it is the most important thing about London right now. Rome's citizens in the 4th century AD still attended the games, still ate, still traded, still built. The legions were still on the frontiers. The aqueducts still ran. The empire looked, from the inside, like an empire. The cracks were in the structure, and structures take time to translate their cracks into the kind of visible collapse that everyone agrees to call collapse. London today still has the games and the aqueducts. The spectacle is still extraordinary. The restaurants in the good years of the Soho calendar still produce evenings that remind you why you moved there, if you moved there, or why you wanted to if you never did. The language, the legal system, the publishing, the theater, the football, the particular energy of a city that somehow contains every culture on earth while remaining unmistakably itself. These things are real. They are not marketing. They are London's genuine genius, and they are not disappearing on the timeline of a YouTube video. But the structural story is different from the experiential story. And the structural story is the one that determines where this city is in 20 years. The structural story says this: the mechanism that made London uniquely powerful is broken. The financial architecture that concentrated global capital here has been partially disassembled and partially relocated. The tax environment that once looked competitive by European standards has become punitive for the high earners who generated disproportionate fiscal contributions. The housing market has become structurally unaffordable for the cohort that historically renewed the city's creative and economic energy. And the political framework that would be required to address these structural problems is itself trapped in a cycle of short-term electoral calculation that makes the necessary interventions nearly impossible to execute. Empires do not fall because of one betrayal. They fall because of accumulated structural failures that no single decision can reverse. London is there. The city is still magnificent, but the empire is falling. And the people who understand what an empire actually is, the bankers, the investors, the talent, the quietly ambitious, they already know it. That is why they are leaving. The question that every city in this position eventually has to answer is not whether to arrest the decline. Decline of this structural depth is not arrested by policy adjustments. The question is, what kind of city you want to be in the era that follows the imperial one? Venice answered it with beauty and memory. Lisbon answered it with livability and culture. Amsterdam, which was once the financial capital of the world before London took that crown, answered it by becoming something smaller, gentler, and surprisingly happy. There are worse fates. There are better ones too, but they require an honesty about what is happening that London's establishment has not yet demonstrated the capacity to provide. We started with a question: how does the British Empire's capital quietly fall? The answer is this: the same way every empire falls. Not in fire. Not in a single dramatic moment that history agrees to call the end. But in 1,000 small decisions made by talented people who looked at what the city had become and decided to build their futures somewhere else. In dark windows on Bond Street. In transaction volumes that keep failing to recover. In a former private banker in Geneva using the past tense to describe the city that once made him. The signs are visible to anyone who has learned to read them. London is not gone. But London, as the world's operating system, as the place where everyone who mattered had to eventually come, that version of London is receding. And it is receding on a timeline that is no longer measured in generations. It is measured in years. Empires do not fall in a day. They fall in patterns. If you want to keep watching the next ones collapse before everyone else notices, subscribe to Empire Falls. We are documenting the cities that history will remember, not for their glory, but for how quietly they let it slip away. The next chapter is already loading. And if you found yourself recognizing this city, if you have felt that something about London has shifted in a way that nobody in power wants to name, tell us in the comments. We read every one. Because you already know what most people are still refusing to see.